First of all, I'd like to welcome you to Fredericksburg and Spotsylvania National Military Park, and specifically to the 2016 Fredericksburg National Cemetery luminaria. It was exactly 150 years ago this year that this cemetery was first created. It was created right on the heels of America's bloodiest conflict, the American Civil War, a war in which more than 700,000 Americans perished. Hardly anybody in either North or South did not know somebody who had not died during that war. Almost everybody had a brother, a father, a son, a neighbor, a friend who had died during those 4 years of fighting. And so as soon as the war ended, people in both the North and the South kind of in one voice cried out for the proper burial of their loved ones. Keep in mind, many of these soldiers had died on the field of battle and had not been properly buried. They had been buried in very hasty graves, very close to where they fell, and in many cases, they had not been buried at all. Their bones still lay moldering out amongst the leaves and fields throughout the South. So the people on both sides wanted their dead buried. The Northern government decided to bury the Northern dead. They were not going to bury the Confederate dead. It was still too close to the war for that. The Southerners were still considered traitors and not worthy of an honorable burial, at least not with federal funds. So the Southerners were going to have to take care of their own. But the Northern government did make provision for the burial of the Northern dead. Starting in 1866, they created no fewer than 73 national cemeteries, this being one of the largest of those national cemeteries. Here were buried approximately 15,000 Union soldiers gleaned from no fewer than 6 major battlefields of the Civil War: Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, Wilderness, Spotsylvania Courthouse, North Anna River, and Mine Run. In addition to this, they also buried soldiers who had died during the very harsh winter encampment of 1862 to 1863, when the Union armies camped just across the river in Stafford County. It took them about 2 years to gather in those bodies from this 30-mile wide radius and bring them here to Fredericksburg. While some crews were doing that, other crews were working to make this hillside into a national cemetery. They did that by terracing the front of the hillside, adding 8 different terraces there to open up more land for burials. They added what was initially a fence around the 12-acre cemetery, later transformed into a wall. As soldiers were brought in, they put headboards over each of the graves. 6,800 of them later again converted into headstones. Once they had everybody buried here, they then set their minds to the task of beautifying this cemetery. Fredericksburg National Cemetery and all the other national cemeteries were not simply to be a repository for the dead, but rather a place of remembrance for those they left behind. And so, up until about 1880, for a period of about 15 years or so, the federal government began beautifying these places by, for instance, here planting about 1,000 different trees on this once barren hilltop. They also added hedges, flower gardens, things of that nature. As time went on, they would add monuments. They would erect upright cannons and would even add placards with poetry on them. Again, all in an effort to make this a place of deeper meaning than simply a regular graveyard. Now, once this was all created, they needed somebody to take care of it. And so for that purpose, they began hiring superintendents, one for each of these 73 national cemeteries. Superintendents were selected based on a variety of criteria, but generally speaking, they were soldiers who had been non-commissioned officers during the Civil War. That is, either corporals or sergeants, and they were almost invariably men who had been wounded and disabled during the Civil War. So this was a way to give honorable veterans who had sacrificed a limb, perhaps, to the effort, a way of giving them a job that they could handle following the war. These men, in return for their services, earned $75 a month, which is pretty good pay in those days, and also got free housing. If you walked up through the cemetery gate as you first entered, off to your right was a stone building, and that was the Cemetery Keeper's Lodge. Now, to earn that money, they had some duties to do. They did not themselves cut the grass and do the trimming. Why? They were disabled. But they did supervise those who did that work. So they were supervisors. They also were administrators. They had to order supplies. They had to write reports. They had to deal with the superiors in Washington, D.C. If visitors came in and wanted to find a grave, they had to figure out where the grave was and take them to it. But their biggest job, by far and away, their most important job, was to secure the cemetery from vandalism. There was a almost a paranoia in the North that these bitter Southerners who now lost the war were going to take their vengeance on the fallen dead of the North by coming to these cemeteries and desecrating the graves. So superintendents were not under any circumstances to leave one of these cemeteries unattended at any time, day or night. If they themselves just need to go in town to buy a plug of tobacco, they had to designate somebody to be here in their stead. It could never be left unattended. Now, Fredericksburg, during its 74-year history under the Army administration, had no fewer than 13 superintendents. Of those 13, 5 are buried here today. One of those men is Richard Hill. Richard Hill was actually born in England and came to the United States on the eve of the Civil War. He was only a teenager when he enlisted in the Union Army to fight with the 2nd Ohio Heavy Artillery. Twice during the war he was wounded. Later on in the 1880s he got a job with the government and was assigned a position as a cemetery superintendent, not here at Fredericksburg, but down near Petersburg, Virginia at Poplar Grove National Cemetery. Later he was transferred to Fredericksburg, but in the meanwhile he had lost a son. He and his wife, Mary Ann, had a little baby boy, and after just a few months that boy had died. So Richard buried the son in the most logical spot in Poplar Grove National Cemetery, where he was then serving. Later, when he's transferred up here, his wife Mary Ann will die while he's serving here. So he will bury her here in Fredericksburg National Cemetery, and will have Arthur's remains moved from Petersburg up here and buried with his wife. So here you see the grave of Arthur Moore Hill and Mary Ann Hill. Richard himself lived on for about another 20 years, moved to a couple other cemeteries, but when he retired in 1920, he returned here to Fredericksburg, and just a few months after moving back to this town, he himself died, and his surviving children then had him buried in the plot next to his wife and children. Today, this is the only family group buried in Fredericksburg National Cemetery. There are other family relationships here. There are a couple brothers buried here. There's a brother and a sister buried here. Fathers and sons buried here. But this is the only mother, father, child combination here in Fredericksburg National Cemetery.